Okay, so people are going to keep wandering in, I think, for a couple more minutes. But while they do that, sorry to interrupt our wonderful, rich conversation, but it will continue through your talk. So we'll look forward to that. First, just to say to those of you who are new to the series, this is our 8th lecture of a series entitled Migration and Displacement, Histories, Stories, and Myths. So very much welcome to you, new guests, our usual participants and students. And the series is part of our exploration here at Potsdam University, supported by the DAAD, to think about incorporating subjects of migration and mobility in our studies programs. And I'm not doing this alone. This is together with Marcia Schenk and Filippo Carla Uhing, as well as Eike Faber and the wonderful team at Potsdam. So just going ahead, what we're going to do here today is from Dr. Ria Kapoor, and there will be about a 45-minute presentation, followed by about a 30-minute discussion. So please raise your hands or put your comments in the chat. So first, to begin with, as an introduction to Dr. Kapoor's work, who will be presenting on an alien invasion, in quotes, making refugees in India. And Ria is a Simon Research Fellow at the University of Manchester and an editorial fellow with History Workshop Online. And in her research, she explores whether an alternative conception of the refugee regime, rather than the one centered on the UNHCR, exists in India. Through her work, she writes the post-colony into histories of human rights and refugee-related humanitarianism. She's particularly interested in how ideas and practices in what we call the Global South transform the wider notion of the refugee and related concerns of rights and entitlements. Now, we've already had the pleasure of having a more in-depth conversation with Ria in our People Out of Place class last week, as she has just published her book with Oxford University Press, Making Refugees in India, which offers a historical perspective from the so-called Global South. And it concerns the global history of India's refugee regime before and beyond partition. It brings the human rights and self-determination into tension and draws together the bureaucratic categories of refugee, citizen, and minority, demonstrating the history of internationalism as a transition from colonialism to post-colonialism. So thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today, Ria. Over to you.
Thank you so much for being here today, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get to be here a second time in a week, and I'm going to do my best not to repeat what we've already talked about and to widen the field from last week's chat. So before I begin, I'm going to draw your attention to this timeline in the hopes of helping you keep track of what I'm going to talk about. In particular, I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the 1946 Foreigners Act, with amendments and some support by other acts, it still remains India's primary rule and law to deal with all aliens and all foreigners. However, it came into force under the eye of the nationalist-led interim government, that is a government made of Indian and soon to be Pakistani anti-colonial nationalists, in power before independence, but appointed once it was clear that the British would leave. It also happens to come into being in 1946, so 1 year before Indian and Pakistani independence, and more notably, before the mass displacements of the partition of the subcontinent. Now, India famously doesn't have a refugee law, nor has it signed the 1951 Convention, nor the 1967 Protocol on the Status of Refugees. And yet it has hosted significant numbers of refugees. In fact, most of South Asia is not party to the Refugee Convention, and we did talk last week about why this is a book about India and not about broader South Asia. Now, today I want to talk to you about the idea of the refugee in India, and most particularly how that idea came to change over the course of the 20th century. I want to start not by talking of the partition of India, but the displacements of which began in 1947, but about a plane manufacturer, hence the planes in the background to this slide. This man called Antonius Raab, who was the manufacturer of Raab Katzenstein aircraft for any aviation enthusiasts amongst us. Now, Antonius Raab and his wife Hilda were subjects of the princely state of Baroda, which would later be absorbed into the Indian Union. At the time, they were these subjects at the time that they were deported in 1948. He had briefly set up an airplane factory in Baroda and produced 2 whole gliders before this operation was shut down because he was deported. They'd come to India within the subset of Balkan refugees of various nationalities, within which they were subclassified as enemy aliens, as the British identified them as German nationals, even though, for a long, complicated set of reasons, Antonius held Costa Rican documents at the time. They were then recast as alien friends because it was confirmed that they did, in fact, hold anti-Nazi sentiments. Itself also telling how flexible the category of the refugee was, really. Now, Antonius was working for the government of Baroda, as I mentioned, a princely state within the larger India. And, roughly corresponded to what we would think of as a skilled worker today, working on aviation and plane making. And yet he was thrown out. So why was the independent Indian government insistent on throwing them out? Notably, the Indian government said it was repatriating the Rabs, even though they had no desire to leave the country. The decision to repatriate them had come not from the government of independent India or even the interim government that had nationalist leaders in it. That decision had been made by the British Indian government in 1945. However, since 1946, once Indian leaders came to the helm, these nationalist governments had also been pursuing this, even before the mass displacements of partition. So the Rabs were eventually removed from India under the terms of the 1946 Foreigners Act, which really doesn't make any distinction between any foreigners, uniting all of them in being Indian. Tourist, you're a foreigner. Refugee, you're a foreigner. It doesn't matter. By the second half of 1947, the partition of India had changed who it was who could be called a refugee in India. That is, these refugees who by virtue of religion were pushed over the newly created borders of India and Pakistan, pointing to a new, completely different subcontinental use of that category. But the Rab story clearly points to something else. These European foreigners could not stay on in India, and their refugee status and even repatriation was transformed into a deportation. Now, the choice to start this talk, and indeed my book, with the story of the Rabs is a very deliberate one. It's such a great example of why India's refugee is a much bigger global story of decolonization, of rights, and of a refusal to codify the category of the refugee. It serves to point to several things, not least that the refugee in India did not begin with partition alone. Despite how that crisis shaped the subcontinent and its new states, but instead points to a global story of empire, of internationalism, of an engagement that exceeded the Indian subcontinent in the short term, but also the long term. The refugee was made simply a foreigner, quite literally in the case of Rab, but also metaphorically. That is, the internationally recognized notion of the refugee, endorsed by the UN itself, became alien to India. So in today's talk, I'm going to introduce you to some of the big ticket ideas of my book, those that haven't been introduced already, but then focus on the 1940s, but not so much on the partition. In particular, I think India's alternative approach to refugees has its roots in the transition of the Indian state from the colony to the post-colonial nation state, and so a very hard-won self-determination. India itself was part of that first wave of mid-20th century decolonizations in Asia and Africa. And the shift from colonial to post-colonial in the subcontinent itself mirrored a slow transition from an international order made up of colonial empires, as the League of Nations was, to the world order of the United Nations, one that eventually came to be based on a collection of nation states. Though, as we were just saying, Lena, nobody could tell you in the 1940s that the nation state was the inevitable global political entity that we think of it as today. However, what the Rab story also reveals is that India had experiences with refugees, defined as such by India's British rulers and recognized even internationally as refugees, even before it had become formally recognized as a nation state. So in India, the rights of refugees were not necessarily measured against those of the rights of citizens, because Indians were not really citizens, not before the middle of the century. They were measured against the rights of non-white subjects of a colonial empire. With the achievement of the post-colonial nation state, the definition of the refugee would only then keep changing in relation to the citizen of India, with the category becoming both constitutive and destructive of citizenship itself, and so the larger collective in whose name the Indian state had come into being. That is, the collective who was the basis for Indian self-determination. So long story short, in my study of how India's leaders conceived of the refugee over the course of the 20th century, I see the refugee as caught between the tension of individual human rights against the collective right to self-determination, precisely because of the origin of Indian rights themselves. They had to come from the nation state. Within all of this, I'd like to add, however, is that I hold that it was not the individual refugee so much as the wider political implications and interventions in the name of the refugee that worried India, that the idea of the refugee needed to diverge because international politics had not yet shed an imperial cloak in the view of the Indian leaders, that is. The rights of the refugee were thus caught between an Indian state that believed in the power of world-making, to borrow from Adam Getachew, and which believed in self-determination as the source of rights for its people, yes, but also created a pulpit. It's the source of the pulpit that allowed Indian people to engage in a process of reordering the international order, remaking the world, and to speak to wider rights, wider dignity, wider human rights even, which in India's case, for example, manifested as arguing for minority rights for a South Asian diaspora in South Africa in 1946, for example, which many historians have written about in the last few years and which I'll loop back to. Now, in my book, this is a really expansive history, and I've noted what each of the chapters covers in case anyone wants to come back to this later. But India's voluntary exclusion from the UN-led regime is accompanied by that long history of allowing and even supporting refugees, whether those of partition, those from Tibet who came over with the Dalai Lama, those from Sri Lanka, those from East Pakistan, from Afghanistan, and so on. Rohingya most recently, not that that's gone very well for them. In the last two cases in my book, that of Tibet and East Pakistan, Nehru, India's first prime minister, Nehru's government strongly discouraged formal UN intervention in the case of the Tibetan refugees, even as the government did work with many agencies and international bodies to support them anyway. For the East Pakistanis, on the other hand, about a decade later, the Indian government strongly encouraged that the international community address the root cause that forced the refugees to leave their home, in stark contrast to never once talking about China's action in Tibet. In the case of East Pakistan, they've talked about East Pakistani Bengali self-determination, which largely the international community didn't heed. So independent India has a history of engaging with the United Nations and other international bodies for many refugees, not just these from Tibet and East Pakistan. But all of that I think can be traced back to both how India's leaders saw the international order, first the League, then the United Nations, and how the ideas that this international order of the League and the UN, the ideas articulated, could not sit easily with promises of progress, development, and decolonization that India's leaders aspired to, not just for India's people, but for all colonized peoples. Famously, mid-century India thinks it speaks and stands up for a lot of the colonized world. I think that a particularly Nehruvian internationalism shaped this. And Nehruvian, is derived from Jawaharlal Nehru, the first prime minister, but also the primary architect of a lot of the primary nationalist party, the Indian National Congress's international outlooks and approaches, even prior to independence. Now, this is also perhaps why the logic of my study ends with the first few very ideologically driven decades of India's independence. This view of the world was shaped by an understanding of how notions of humanitarian action, of charity, and of solidarity, also of nuclear power, disarmament, and other things, but we're going to focus on this bit, seem to apply really differently to colonized peoples. But this is also peppered with tensions with other states in Asia and Africa, and I'll come to this towards the end of our session today. The decision not to participate in the 1951 convention, and so the UNHCR regime, has often been attributed to a total lack of support that India received for partition's refugees. However, the work of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, famously UNRWA, the big post-war reconstruction agency working across the world, never extended to India. The war was only seen as having damaged India's edges, allegedly. Now, even before partition then, India was not part of post-war reconstruction as an international enterprise. So I believe, therefore, India's withdrawal has its roots based on what happened prior to the birth of subcontinental nation states, taking into account both how it engaged with the international order, but also how it engaged with humanitarianisms and rights. So coming to the question of refugees in India before 1947, many groups were referred to as refugees. This could include political exiles from places like Afghanistan. It could be Indian people themselves displaced by violence or disaster within the subcontinent, what we would probably call IDPs today, internally displaced people today. It could refer to those of the Zoroastrian Parsi in India community who fled Iran for reasons such as famine. Not all of these groups were helped by the government. In fact, the Parsis, or the Zoroastrians, often relied on relief from co-religionists in the country. Displaced Indian people receive very patchy government help, often relying instead on community groups or kin. But perhaps more interestingly for our conversation today, refugees in India could include a large number of European people. Now, by the early 1920s, some groups in India drew the attention of the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, drew the attention of the League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, a man called Fridtjof Nansen, who I'm sure some of you have heard of, but we can talk about him later if you haven't. He would write to the British government of India to arrange for European refugees in the subcontinent to be returned and resettled. Many of these people were to be repatriated to their correct countries, to Hungary or Austria or Poland, or any of the new nation states born out of the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, there are two things worth mentioning here. These people didn't arrive in India as refugees. In the documents, they're enemy aliens or internees or something like that. They left it as repatriates and refugees. It was in some ways the end of the First World War and Nansen's and a wider Europe's recognition of refugees that these people in India also came to be seen as refugees. Now, those of these European people in India who did not fit the new nation states' political parameters, who threatened these new nation states in Europe's existence or political stability, sort of fade into obscurity in the archives I use. I couldn't tell whether they were ever able to leave India, and if so, where they went, if they couldn't go to this home nation state in Europe. Now, Indian people within the subcontinent, and indeed there is some literature on how humanitarian support could be a way to show solidarity and political legitimacy in colonial India for Indian groups and Indian leaders, stepped in where the British government didn't and couldn't in cases of crises. Now, quite clearly, documents show how British officials expected family groups to take care of people in crisis. In contrast, European refugees were sent to camps, often sorted by age and nationality. By World War II, they were given classes in vocations and knitting and things like that. However, some people were allowed to leave if they found skilled work. So you could go off, leave your refugee camp and go off and be a doctor somewhere. However, to maintain the myth of modernity and racial superiority that underpinned an empire, the uneducated and poor white people remained in these camps. And this was a conscious choice. Further, these European refugees who were not subjects of the British Empire could move more easily within its territories than Indian people who were subjects of the empire. Racial policies were linked with controlling migration, with white settler dominions, Australia, Canada, and South Africa all enacting barriers, using measures like higher fees or higher income thresholds for Indian people to enter. In the case of Australia, it used a dictation test in any European language, chosen on the spot, to allow or more often not allow entry. London condoned these policies, instructing magistrates in Indian districts to even limit who they could issue passports to, usually the wealthy and the well-educated. I'm not going to go into the history of why passports exist in the first place today, but not necessarily for good reasons. Events like Canada's refusal in 1914 to let the ship carrying Indian Sikh migrants, the Komagata Maru, made evident that Indians had fewer rights than other subject citizens of the British Empire, despite their equal status on paper to, say, someone living in London or someone in Canada already who was of a different skin color, basically. So the story of the Komagata Maru is that the reason it wasn't allowed to land was that it failed the clause of continuous journey, which basically meant that you had to go on a direct journey from the port you started in to the port you went. You couldn't change ships, basically. You couldn't really stop for a long period of time. For a journey at that point of time from the subcontinent to Canada, that was unlikely, possibly impossible. So just to sort of illustrate just what the nature of these measures were. In fact, these questions of equality on paper had other impacts as well. Gandhi's first nonviolent movement, his first nonviolent satyagraha, was actually in search of the rights as citizens of the Indian diaspora in South Africa. So this was more, it wasn't really more in general terms of human rights or non-white people's rights. It was specifically claiming that legal status that in theory they would have had. So the situation of Indians beyond the subcontinent made very clear the discriminatory hierarchies of empire, even within a framework of legality. India, on the other hand, had become a place to put displaced people, and they could enjoy greater rights than Indians did when they were there, despite their positions as British subjects. Now, much of this nationalist leaders concluded had to do with the lack of Indian representation in self-government. The League of Nations condoned the imperialisms of the great powers, particularly the French and British. Indeed, these powers had helped shape the League in the first place. India was represented at the League, but its delegation had been chosen by the British. So it was often seen as sort of a second extra vote for the British. Thus, the international order that could recognize people as refugees, that could make all of these big pronouncements and create these norms, was itself intertwined with the same imperialism that these Indian people were experiencing domestically within the bounds of the subcontinent. Now, by the 1930s and 40s, various refugees continued to arrive in India, including Jews from Europe. Interestingly, they too often relied on the support of co-religionists in Bombay and places like that rather than the government. In addition, those evacuated from Balkan territories and elsewhere, who normally had some kind of British document, would also end up sent to places like Egypt and India, largely because nowhere else would take them. They were of European descent, most of these people. But it is events of 1942, perhaps, that most solidly drove home how refugees could be treated differently by the Indian government, that this is the British Indian government. With the Japanese advancing in the east and reaching the Burmese border, many Anglo-Indians, Europeans, and Burmese Indians evacuated that country to try and come to India. Their treatment was markedly different. Europeans were given a preference for safer, easier escape routes. And once in India, people would find luxury quarters for them. They'd rustle up servants for them. The government launched several schemes for Europeans to help them restart business activities, amongst other things. At the same time, this was not the case for Indian people. They were given less preferential access and very little to no government support in terms of rehabilitating themselves once they'd left. At the same time, the British were engaged in discussing constitutional reform for India in return for full-throated nationalist support for the Second World War. The Indian National Congress was not happy about being dragged into the war, certainly not without its permission. And Gandhi and the Indian National Congress had rejected this because they could not support a war against fascism, Britain's noble cause against fascism, when a similarly oppressive imperial regime was being enacted by that same entity in India, at least as they saw it. So Nehru would even tell Stafford Cripps, the head of this mission, this constitutional mission, that the different treatments meted out to refugees from Burma made clear exactly what the true nature of the regime was. There were, of course, many other reasons why that constitutional reform was rejected. And subsequently, Gandhi would launch the famous Quit India movement, and the Congress leaders would all be sent to jail. So Nehru wasn't released until the end of the San Francisco conference, that saw the birth of the UN, which I'll also come back to in a minute. Now, the other thing to point out, before I go on, the images on the slide, in case you can't read the captions, are the one on the left is Burmese Indian refugees on the road to India, and the one on the right is Polish children refugees in Balachadi. Now, the other thing to point out is what happened to European refugees in India in the immediate aftermath of the war. By 1946, UNRWA and then the International Refugee Organization took responsibility for groups like the Poles who had gone to India. Even in 1948, the IRO, the International Refugee Organization, continued to follow up on these people, by which point Nehru's government insisted that they just needed to leave. These refugees needed to go, even if they had expressed the desire to stay on. However, those people of subcontinental descent, those diasporas, who had been displaced from Southeast Asia, were not supported at all by the British government, nor the IRO, nor UNRWA. As I mentioned, UNRWA, and so the wider humanitarian reconstruction effort, didn't support India. Now, leaders like Nehru deplored this as being part of a larger problem of internationalism, but also of humanitarianism. That it was ignorant of the nature of imperialism and colonialism and how they functioned. However, British India, so India, but under British control, had contributed resources to UNRWA, and more on this in a bit, and how this comes back to shape decisions. So India had experiences of differing arbitrary uses of the category of refugees and migrants and of migration itself. And this shaped its leaders' approaches to movement in the post-1945 world order of the United Nations, as they feared continued impositions despite formal decolonization. So in 1946, at the relevant session of the Economic and Social Council at the United Nations, India's representative Frank Anthony would say that India had taken the fullest responsibility for its own refugees and had already contributed to international efforts without any benefits to itself. It would not be taking part formally in the International Refugee Organization. And indeed, an often repeated line when India withdrew from all international refugee efforts in 1946 was that India was unsuitable for Europeans, and this would keep coming up. And indeed, keep in mind, the lion's share of those drafting international conventions were indeed doing so with a view to solving the problem of European refugees. And as you recall, the 1951 convention was once very narrowly defined to mean only European refugees displaced by the war. It was not until several years later that refugees beyond Europe were formally recognized by the international community of the UN, and there was a corresponding evolution of India's policies too, obviously. Now, by 1947, India had other refugees to worry about, those of partition. Now, these partition refugees were folded into a new developmentalist reconstructive program for a surgically smaller India, one which had lost Pakistan, much as these refugees themselves had lost their homes in the territories that were now Pakistan. So this brings us to the question of what is going on with that tension between human rights and self-determination, and why should we care? Now, I'd like to point out again, how self-determination was so important for India's participation in the United Nations war effort. And I say this because it's worth remembering that the UN was a wartime alliance that then turned into a peacetime international organization. Each of these differences, whether it was a different treatment of European mobility versus Indian mobility, or even different support to refugees, pointed to how legal status within the British Empire meant very little by way of security for Indians. In truth, the only way Indian people could argue for their rights was a nation state, in the eyes of its anti-colonial leaders at least. This came eerily close to a version, doesn't it, of Hannah Arendt's right to have rights, the need for a theater to exercise one's humanity, and the primacy of the fullest citizenship of that sovereign, self-determined entity. So I suppose there is a mid-century uniformity here somewhere. Now, the British rejection of Indian self-government and independence as a precondition for nationalist support for the war also then fueled a mistrust of the founding principles of this international order that came out of that same war. Now, Jawaharlal Nehru, as I said, the first Indian Prime Minister, had been hugely critical of the war effort, particularly because nobody had asked Indian leaders whether they wished to take part in the war, these democratically elected Indian leaders. And it led to the resignation of the provincial ministries formed by the Indian National Congress. And as he would say about the Atlantic Charter of 1941, the widely held to be a founding moment of the United Nations, it was a pious and nebulous expression of hope, which stimulates nobody. And even this, Mr. Churchill does not apply to India. He's referring here, of course, to the clauses that alluded to self-determination in the Atlantic Charter. And at the birth of the United Nations, India's leaders, and here I also include the leaders of the Muslim League of what would become Pakistan, were excluded from the 1945 San Francisco Conference that decided the shape of the new order. The Indian delegation was once again chosen by the British. This was an order that would also embrace some colonial continuities, like the presence of a trusteeship council or a disproportionate power of vetoes held by a few nation states, which exists today even, right? At its inception, therefore, the United Nations did not inspire much confidence in the Indian anti-colonial nationalist leaders' mind, who were determined that this new international order would not become a cloak for their subjugation, the way they had perceived the League of Nations to be. The first test, for example, which historians like Mark Matsauer, Alana O'Malley, Raphael Khan, and others have written about, was a suit against racial discrimination against those of Indian descent in South Africa in 1946. And 2/3 of the United Nations General Assembly ended up voting with India. This was not to Nehru and his sister, Mrs. Pandit, who was the head of the Indian delegation, simply a question of the rights of the diaspora, the Indian diaspora. They actually saw this as Western civilization itself being on trial. It was a way to challenge that colonial notion of the white man's burden and challenge the civilizational mission of white settler colonialism, where a form of modernity was used as a justification for an absolute and tyrannical government. And that in itself had actually shaped the international order in many ways. And so they wanted to challenge how a current international modernity had also entrenched a system of inequality and discrimination and a denial of rights. So the soon-to-be Indian nation state was acting both to secure its own people's rights, but also saw itself acting as a wider symbol of a resurgent Asia and Africa. International forms were certainly seen as something that could be remade and internationalism itself challenged. There's a really great project, in fact, being run out of the University of Leeds on the Global South and the shaping of the UN International Order for anyone who's interested. Now, what does all of this have to do with instruments like the Refugee Convention or with the right to asylum? More individual abstract concepts of rights were just rejected. For example, Nehru was deeply unimpressed even by the 1941 tome, The Rights of Man by H.G. Wells. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of it, but it was quite influential in its time and spoke of all of these noble values. Now, to Nehru, rights such as Wells described could not exist under a system dominated by imperialism and capitalism as empires like the British one upheld. And he wrote as much in a review of this book in a newspaper. On the eve of the framing of the Universal Declaration, he would decline to be part of the International League of the Rights of Man, which was an advisory body on the eventual framing of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He saw his participation as being something of a spectatorial role, these rights in some ways just not applying or not necessarily being fully relevant. He said he had lost his enthusiasm for bodies that worked for old objectives. So presumably those of a world order that was not as inclusive as Nehru would like it to be. Now, it's also been noted that the wider United Nations Charter and specifically the Universal Declaration marked a serious walking back of the more emancipatory potential of self-determination than the Atlantic Charter had floated. So if all humans were inherently rights-bearing after all, as the Universal Declaration indicated, then the collective that these rights could secure, that could secure rights was unnecessary. And so it limited the call for independence in other colonial territories. Now, within this declaration, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, a person could seek asylum, although there was no obligation for a state to grant it. As B.N. Rao, an erstwhile member of one of India's first UN delegations and general big deal, also involved in framing the constitution and things, as he pointed out, the Universal Declaration proclaimed, and I'm quoting here, proclaimed that rights were not generally admitted in the law, proclaimed rights that were not generally admitted in the law of various countries. So on top of that, he made a point to say that the right to seek asylum was different than the right to be granted it. And additionally, he pointed out to where the limits to rights and freedoms were. That is, where they impinged upon general welfare, the greater good, so to speak. However, the Indian delegation at the United Nations enthusiasm for the drafting of the Universal Declaration was also quite well recorded. So, of course, how they approached it, they were quite careful so as not to complicate issues of linguistic, regional, and other separatisms. And so those other smaller issues of collective rights within India, but that's another story for another time. In India, therefore, the rights of its people were seen as something different from the rights that had been codified in the Universal Declaration. They came from Indians' participation in the state, but it also allowed the state to negotiate at the UN in favor of a broader human rights, a different, slightly altered version of rights more generally, to seek the rights of diasporas, and certainly a way to alter the world order. And indeed, under Nehru, the Indian state pursued his project of one world, of an equal international order, one based on peace and disarmament. But it also pointed to a world where it also pointed out that equality did not already exist. They're working towards it, clearly. It had very practical ramifications on the ground for what it meant to be a refugee, a figure whose rights had certainly been stepped upon, nobody's discounting that, but who had also crossed international borders. So universal rights in this Indian anti-colonial nationalist imaginary were certainly to be aspired to, but not in a way that threatened Indian people's rights, and not in a way that included Indian people's experiences. Now, the political nature of humanitarianism was not lost on India's nationalist leaders. The British imperial power's humanitarian activity, such as famine relief in the 18th and 19th centuries, could be quite laissez-faire in its approach, for example, using work as a criteria for offering relief, and could ignore local knowledge and needs. It could be very targeted. Now, Indian nationalist leaders themselves had relied on humanitarianism to declare subversive political positions that ran contrary to the official British Indian states. For example, Maria Framka has written about the Congress sending medical missions to Spain and to China, but not to those on the same side that the British was supporting, but to the other one. So humanitarian action itself was never a problem, not even international humanitarianism, given Indian leaders' willingness to work with the Red Cross both before and after partition. And independence. But it was a type of humanitarianism and the politics of humanitarianism that could pose that problem. Now, this is a great example. As I mentioned, UNRWA had not taken charge of any of the displaced Indians, only Europeans, nor would it take part in reconstruction activities in India. During the actual war, so before 1945, UNRWA had been lobbied to support those who suffered because of the Bengal famine that took hold in 1942. This was denied, and that's what the newspaper article on the right is about. The American League of India made a plea for relief to starving masses, denied. But as all of this was going on, India remained a massive contributor to UNRWA, which I suppose also explains the nature of colonial economies during the war, right? You could still be exporting things while having a famine. Similarly, the International Refugee Organization, UNRWA's successor, didn't take note of Indians, only Europeans displaced in the area. But as Captain A.W.T. Webb of the British forces of the British Indian establishment, who had headed the subcontinental refugee operation during the Second World War, also pointed out, if India took part in the International Refugee Organization, it would be the fifth largest contributor, but with absolutely no benefit to itself and the Indian people. And as you can see with the article on the right of the screen, this is not the only observation. So with UNRWA itself, there's a reflection on how India could contribute a lot, but the main focus always remained, in terms of help, always remained Germany or Italy or somewhere else in Europe. So international humanitarian efforts for refugees, but perhaps even more widely, remain concentrated towards Europeans in an international order that had not invited Indian anti-colonial nationalists to help frame its core constitution in 1945, as we learned with the exclusion from San Francisco. And India would still have to pay a vast amount and meet obligations on top of all of this. Now, UNRWA and the IRO were both agencies that focused on material assistance and reconstruction, which were actually quite compatible with the Nehruvian developmentalist state's broader vision, as well as its approach to refugees, which became clear with the partition. But the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees instead focused on rights which had been lost, but only for a few select people, Europeans displaced by the Second World War. Now, despite a regime change to a new American world hegemon after 1945, these imperially created hierarchies clearly remained. The internationally created refugee, therefore, was still owed more in the eyes of the international order than the average Indian. And those same international norms threatened the promise of progress and of rights that self-determination could bring, and, still wanted to access certain resources. And so in flattening all aliens into a single category, the refugee was just never existed in Indian law, removed, obliterated, never had a chance, whatever you'd like to call it. But the main purpose was to resist an alien internationalism, one which had been based on immigration rules, racial hierarchies, and tiers of rights born in an age of empire, but which threatened to carry on into the post-1945 world order. This flattening and this removal of the international idea of the refugee also allowed a use of the term refugee and of practices of rehabilitation for those who didn't meet the international definition, but were nonetheless part of the many mobilities and displacements of the 1940s. Not just those of partition, but also of an Indian diaspora that occupied a dubious position across the world, for example. The notion of the refugee was also made alien for another reason. Because how could it apply or not apply, as the case might be, to those who might actually have a claim on the Indian state in some way or form? So going back to some of the ambiguities we were discussing at the start. And what counted as persecution and what was simply an infringement upon another smaller state's process of decolonization? This brings me to thinking about a different kind of internationalism. Now, in his tome, Brown Empire, this writer, Erskine Weiss, made the case that the British leaving India would be a disaster. It would leave a sub-imperial entity intact. That is, the extended British Indian Empire, governed from Delhi, would now be under Indian nationalist control. It would be under the control of the Congress. Weiss was preying on a very real and very legitimate fear of other Asian and African peoples who aspired to independence. Substantial Chinese and Indian diasporas, many of whom were seen to be in a better position than local people who had been part of the colonial encroachment into these areas. So colonizing even as they were colonized themselves. Now, at the 1947 Asian Relations Conference, so Asian powers come together, some are independent, many are not. There are also observers from non-Asian sites. It was agreed that states had the right to determine the composition of the citizenry, including in racial terms, even, of course, as the same conference argued against various other forms of discrimination, including on racial grounds, go figure. Now, India, too, conceded this. The Indian state under Nehru was committed to not infringing upon the decolonization of other smaller states, but it meant that the Indian diaspora occupied a tricky position. It was at risk of expulsion in some of these places. Eventually, Nehru's government decided that, okay, these diaspora people, they're not Indian citizens. They need to become citizens of the states in which they wish to live and work in, encouraging them to stop sending remittances home, to identify as part of those places, to stay put, be a good citizen of Burma or of East Africa or wherever it is that you are. Naturally, some states like Burma thought this diaspora should leave as early as 1948 in the case of Burma. Not necessarily through expulsion orders, but certainly through citizenship legislation, trade legislation, and regulations that, shall we say, encourage people to leave. And in some cases, like in the case of Uganda, actual expulsion orders. In 1948, the people who left Burma, interestingly, were called refugees. By the 1960s, they were called repatriates to India. And there's a whole other story there, because also by the 1960s, Tibetans were called refugees, and they were very much in the vein of internationally recognized refugees. So perhaps there's a competition there, but that's a different story. Now, these expulsions were never contested in India in terms of the right of these new smaller states to expel those who were not citizens. And for many, many years, the Indian government treated expelled diasporic groups as refugees and rehabilitated them, sometimes in the same types of schemes, maybe even the same schemes used for partition. And all of this points to the complexities of inter-Asian and Afro-Asian belonging, and that unraveling of the British Empire's non-white populations as these waves of decolonization took place. I should probably also mention that the Indian state's discussion of human rights, even in the 1940s, underwent a bit of a change in a way that didn't make the Indian state culpable in the face of its own potential linguistic or regional separatist movements. So you want to keep the Indian entity intact, but also argue for minority rights. So only certain kinds of colonialism are redefined as bad. Self-determination even had to be redefined by the Indian delegations to specifically be a freedom from a narrowly defined type of colonialism. So there's a lot of sort of dancing around the fact that there are different kinds of decolonizations taking place and different kinds of Afro-Asian solidarities manifesting at the same time. So the problems of self-determination, of nation-state building, and of belonging were very clear in the 1940s, both as it related to other Afro-Asian states, but also to India's own citizenship. So while it was very easy to turn all aliens into foreigners when it came to Europeans, it was much more complicated to untangle legal realities for a diaspora that could be seen as imperial, both within this large entity with internal variations as India was, but it was also a problem. It was also complicated in relation to other decolonizing states whose own self-determination Indian mobilities could threaten. Now, India's ambitious internationalism, which sought to resist international practice that perpetuated imperial hierarchies on one hand, was also dealing with questions of citizenship, mobility, and decolonization in these states smaller than itself, and decolonizing after it did, at least formally. So far from being a very simple binary of colonize or colonize, it paved the way for a very complex, longer history of an emancipatory internationalism on the one hand, but also the very real concerns and practicalities for the wider Afro-Asian project of decolonization, but also the serious fragility of Afro-Asian solidarities. The refugee, the repatriate, the foreigner, that flexibility was also essential for a state in process of defining its own people. Even as other states were trying to figure out who belong there. This is also important because these are the very people from whom it drew its claims to self-determination, as did these other states. But one thing was for sure, people like Antonia Straub, the man with the planes, they definitely were not part of either the Indian project nor the Afro-Asian one. And they could lay claims to rights elsewhere, including endorsed by an international order, if not necessarily by another nation state, in a way that some of these other groups couldn't, and other people couldn't. So why is this larger 1940s moment so exciting? And what does it point to in the longer term? I won't go into partition too much right now. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it, and we can also discuss it in our conversation. But I do think that these tensions of Indian self-determination, alongside that of other states of Asia, but also beyond, of the shifting nature of human rights, as well as whose well-being international humanitarian actions sought to ensure and which political projects it could endorse, would manifest repeatedly over the course of the subcontinental history, but perhaps a broader one as well. Now, in my book, I talk about the Tibetan refugee crisis, one that raised questions of Tibetan self-determination, of the tensions of Afro-Asian solidarity, of human rights, and of Cold War battle lines. And the pictures on the right of the slide are sort of trying to point at some of what's going on, perhaps not successfully. In contrast, the Bangladesh crisis, self-determination itself became a solution to displacement. But it also brought up questions of an inadequate international humanitarianism, attention both of the long partition, but also of this relationship of rights, the limits of self-determination, and of a political or perhaps attempt of a humanitarianism that's trying not to be political, but in so doing was endorsing a different kind of politics. Now, this quick peek at the 1940s to me reveals a lot about the wider engagement of a state in transition and how it understands human rights, citizens' rights, and the collective right to self-determination, the right that guarantees all other rights. The refugee became caught in that tension, a figure born prior to the independent decolonizing nation state. And the international norms surrounding this figure of the refugee, deliberate or not, could often ignore these decolonizing states' realities. The internationally defined category of the refugee could not properly encompass the mobilities of diasporas that have moved within empire and were then displaced or expelled by decolonization. Indeed, scholars who've studied the 1967 Protocol for Refugees have pointed out how that instrument globalizes the applicability of the existing refugee definition rather than recrafting it, and therefore something that was not built to be universal has been universalized. I hope I've managed today to do two things, which is both to offer a consideration of refugees in the subcontinent beyond and outside of partition, and secondly, to think of how empire and its aftermath shape tensions of rights and self-determination on which all instruments, international instruments, including those of refugees, are built, but also why they cannot, as a result, always have universal uptake. But the Indian case also offers clarity beyond its own borders. The category of the refugee is deeply malleable, despite any formal legislation around it. What is happening, for example, in the UK today, and I'm not sure if any of you are keeping up with the legal or illegal manipulations of travel, of documentation, of deportation, should make this amply clear. India builds visions of itself. It alters its citizenship, but it preserves rights and self-determination for those it sees as its people. It also reveals but one version of what actions around refugees can do. Collective identity is preserved in much the same way beyond India, and legal instruments are suddenly used to turn some asylum seekers illegal or into economic migrants. It points to a worldwide post-colonial problem, that the collective identity of those receiving refugees is perhaps at the heart of the problem.